Character action games aren't usually my thing. I've never had any interest in, for example, the Devil May Cry's or the Bayonettas. I did play the original God of War for a few hours and absolutely did not care for it. But there is something appealing about Hi-Fi Rush. It might be that it just doesn't take itself seriously. It knows exactly what it wants to do, and that is to be some light-hearted entertainment for a dozen or so hours. The visual style is somewhat comic booky. The sound is fantastic, which is kind of the whole point of the game. The story is mid, but it is elevated above its weight class by some great writing, with interesting characters, both your allies and your enemies, and the jokes are executed well without overstaying their welcome. As far as the combat goes, it's standard character action fare, with dozens of combos you can unlock throughout the course of the game. However, I found that just hitting the basic attack on the beat with only the occasional interjection of a dodge or parry was enough to get me through pretty much the entire game. Obviously this gives you low scores on the style meter, but since I was more interested in the story than the fighting, this really didn't bother me in the slightest. But for those who prefer going for the high score, there's plenty to keep them interested. The game also mixes up the combat by putting in rhythm-based mini-games, and each of the bosses mixes things up nicely. They aren't just a basic combat, only more so, but as the game progresses and more mechanics are introduced, they get added into the boss fights in such a way as to keep you interested. That said, the game did run out of non-boss enemies about halfway through, and decided that the best way to spice things up was to just throw 2 or 3 of the previously encountered mini-bosses at you in a single arena, which I found got a bit stale after a while. Outside of combat, the platforming was terrible. The camera positioning makes it hard to know if you're going to land correctly, and the jump has deceptively little forward movement, so you'll often land short. And then when you try to correct with an air dash, you'll overcompensate and go flying off the other side of the platform. And sometimes even just simple forward progress can be frustrating. The grapple points were often hidden behind the HUD or not even on the screen at all, leaving you spending several minutes trying to figure out where the game actually wants you to go. Both of these issues led to multiple deaths, especially in sequences where you're on a time limit to get from A to B. But despite the flaws, I did overall enjoy my time in the game. Now, was it good enough to get me interested in other games of this genre? Well, that depends on the individual games, but in general, no, not really. And it's unlikely I'll ever do a second playthrough. But I don't regret the purchase price, and coming from someone who doesn't usually care for these types of games, I think that's pretty high praise.